Hi folks, it's Sammy Osmond here at the Climate Action Reserve. Just like to welcome you all to this workgroup meeting for our Adipic acid protocol production efforts. Oh, sorry, Adipic acid production protocol workgroup efforts. Bit of a mouthful. So I might pause just for a couple of minutes to let folks who are still joining us log in, and then we'll kick off in just a moment.
Good day.
Hey Craig, made it?
I went into the wrong meeting, sorry.
All right, we'll see you a bit later.
All right, thanks.
Good morning, John and Philip. You should be able to speak if that works for you all. You should have muting capability.
Okay, thanks. I'll probably be on mute most of the time.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Morning, folks. I think it's a couple of minutes past, so we can probably get started now. So again, it's welcome to this workgroup meeting for our adipic acid production protocol. Looks like we've got a good number of folks joined in already, so thanks for that. I think we can probably get started. Let me unpause my screen. Great. So feel free to reach out if there's any audio or visual problems. Let me know at any time. Might start off by way of a little bit of housekeeping. So workgroup members will have the opportunity to actively participate throughout the meeting. So we recommend you keep yourselves on mute, and you'll have the ability to unmute yourself whenever you'd like to join in. And we certainly would greatly encourage active discussion throughout. So please feel free to unmute yourself at any time and let us know your thoughts. Otherwise, let's keep everybody on mute. We will ask and take questions throughout the session. All other attendees and observers will be in listen-only mode. However, even for observers, feel free to give us feedback at any point. You'll see there's a user interface. It's usually up on the top right-hand side of the screen. I don't think I've seen it anywhere else, actually. I think it's always there. Right down the bottom, there's a chat function, but on my screen, it's the second row above that. It says questions. That's probably the best place for you to drop any thoughts you have, and our staff at the reserve here will be keeping a close eye on that, and depending on the nature of the question, they might respond to you immediately, or certainly we should have time towards the end of the meeting to circle back and take a look at that, and depending on the nature of the question, we might decide to
Sammy, quick housekeeping.
the group. Yep. Sorry, what was that?
Sammy, quick housekeeping question. This is Bill Flutterbach. I think Lauren is trying to be unmuted as a participant on behalf of Climeco. So if you see that request, if you could unmute her.
Sure. Yep. So we've got a nice cozy little group, so we can probably accommodate multiple people from the same organisations, but you know, generally
Thank you.
one at a time. Looks like we have Lauren now able to speak. Hey, Lauren.
Yep. Hello.
Excellent. Thanks, guys. Thanks for that, Heather. I assume that was Heather in the back there fixing that. And then follow up via email. So at the end of the presentation, we'll have some contact details, and you're all welcome to follow up with us after the session if you have further feedback, or you want to ask questions, or you'd like to engage with us in one-on-one phone discussion or anything like that. And if we don't get to any written questions during the meeting, we'll certainly look to follow up with you offline via email afterwards. And as usual, a copy of the slides as well as a recording of this presentation will be posted online. So just a reminder to folks, these meetings are open to the public, so there could very well be members that are not on the workgroup that are also present. In fact, we certainly do have a few today that are logged in. So Chatham House rules do not apply. A little bit by way of purpose. So as you're probably all aware, what we're trying to do today is really present and solicit feedback, particularly from the workgroup members, on key issues pertaining to this draft adipic acid production protocol. We haven't provided the workgroup with an updated draft for this meeting. We thought it'd be best to just sort of have a good, robust discussion, but we'll get into an agenda which will include process in a moment. And we'll make it clear that certainly we will be providing the workgroup with a detailed, updated draft at some point. And there we have it, the agenda. So what we'll do is run through introductions. I think workgroup members are all familiar with each other, but you know, if you're interested, we can certainly invite you to say hello. Other than that, there's been some changes on the reserve team, so we'll probably go through some brief introductions on our end at least to make sure you know who we are. Then we'll go back to a little bit of a process overview. We'll sort of couch this meeting back in terms of the broader effort here. From there, we'll focus in on the key rationale for having this meeting, identify some key issues and essentially get into some good, robust discussion on those. From there, we can circle back to open discussion as needed. But, you know, as we said before, feel free to jump out at any time. We can keep this as informal as we like. We can make sure we have good discussion whenever folks would like to provide some input. And then that open discussion part can sort of throw it open to any other points that anybody on the workgroup would like to raise. From there, we'll circle back by way of next steps. So it'll be a little bit of a repeat of the process, but we'll sort of invite you to provide feedback within a specific time frame and just sort of hark back to a little bit by way of what we hope to see going forward. Introductions. So reserve staff, Craig Ebert, who's the reserve president. Craig said hello a moment ago. He's actually double or probably triple booked at this point, but he will try to pop in a little bit later. I think probably after the first hour, he should free up. So we can hopefully expect Craig to join us at that point. Myself, I'm Sammy Osman, Senior Policy Manager at Reserve. So I'll be steering this particular effort. I've been at the Reserve about 8 years, I think, pretty familiar with all of you, so I don't think we need too much of an introduction. And then I'll invite the rest of the team to say a quick hello if you'd like to.
Yeah, good morning. This is Heather Raven, and I'm sure I've talked to most of you by now, so good to see you again, and thanks for participating.
Hi, everyone. This is Sarah Westcott, just here with protocol development support for this effort.
And hi, everyone. This is John Remicall. Just like Sarah, I'm here to support the development of the protocol.
Great, thanks guys. And then workgroup members. So I can just run through this list and let folks know who's here and who's not, but certainly if anybody would like to say a few quick words, feel free to. Seth, I believe we will have, let's just quickly check. Maybe we'll do a roll call at least. Seth, are you there? Doesn't look like it. Not quite, but Seth will be joining us. Perhaps one of our staff, if you have his contact details. If you don't, let me know, but just in touch with Seth a moment ago. He said he will be joining us, so we can expect him at some point. But perhaps if one of our team wants to quickly follow up with him, not sure if it's not having any tech issues. Phil, we do have today. Welcome, Phil. Your audio is good. You want to do a quick check? There it is.
Hello, everyone.
Good morning or good evening, depending on where in the world you are. I think you're still in Colorado. And then today from Climeco, we've got Bill, but I believe Lauren's probably going to be doing a lot of the discussion. Would you like to say a quick hello, guys? Confirm you're there.
Yeah, I'm here. Thanks, Sammy. I switched over to a phone just because my internet connection was poor, so hopefully you can hear me well.
Yes.
And Lauren okay, Lauren is on as well.
Yes, I am. Hi.
Great. Thanks, guys. John McDougall. I believe we have John. Welcome, John.
Good morning, everybody.
There you go. Thanks for joining us. And our colleague Lambert Schneider is not able to join us for this meeting. I think he's lucky to be on holiday at the moment. He's also based in Berlin, so that would have presented some challenges. But we've been in regular touch with Lambert. He's provided some specific thoughts that we're going to put to you in relation to some of the key issues, and we're in regular touch with him. So we'll relay detailed discussion back to him and make sure he's fully across all of the outcomes of today's meeting. Okay, process overview. We don't want to bore you to death. I think you all know this well, but let's go through it rapidly nonetheless. Kick things off in September with a bit of a scoping. We typically like to have a look around and make sure what we're doing is plausible. We had an issue paper commissioned in relation to this work, which was very useful, providing a lot of the robust background that was necessary for us to be able to kick this process off. And then from there, we typically move into forming a work group. Throw open an open invite usually, and then we also tend to reach out to specific experts and invite them in. And that's what we did this time. Work group formed shortly thereafter, a couple of meetings in succession. From there, we had a little bit of a pause. During that time, we deliberated further. I think there was a little bit of analysis going on in terms of correlation that we had included in an early draft for a dynamic baseline approach. And then at that point, we came back and presented the work group with an updated draft in April. That elicited some good, robust feedback from the work group. So at that point, rather than move into public comment, we paused. We've spent a good few months deliberating closely with the work group members on some issues raised by the work group. So that was quite useful as well. And so circling back today, we're having another work group meeting. And then from here, we're going to take the discussion back, help us inform some refinements of the protocol. And then we will certainly be presenting the work group with an updated draft for their consideration. And then at some point, our typical process would then lead us to putting a full draft out to the public for the public's consideration, a full 30-day public comment period. One missing step after that is we'll certainly look closely at feedback provided by any members of the public. Sometimes we get a little bit, sometimes none, sometimes quite a lot. So depending on how much feedback we get, we'll certainly take a good close look at that. Let me just pause for a second. Somebody's got their hand up. Does one of our team want to take a look at that and see if, oh, looks like we've got Seth, but he's in the waiting room or he's not able to speak. Maybe we can, there we go. Might just pause for a moment and make sure. Hey, Seth, just want to check, make sure you're...
Yeah, sorry, I had a little technical difficulty, but I'm here now.
Yeah, no problem. We've just gone through basically admin stuff, Seth. Our team at the reserve said a quick hello, so we can make sure you're familiar with all of us. I think you are already. And then from here, we've just moved into a little bit by way of overview of the process. And then we're about to get into the substantive meat of the discussion. So you haven't really missed anything. So thanks for joining us, Seth. Sure. We have the full work group except for Lambert at the moment. So public comment period will certainly distill any lessons learned from that and make refinements as needed. And then the next step is to present the protocol and invite our board to adopt it. So you can see there, those last two steps have a big TBD next to it. Clear message is we're going to make sure we work with key stakeholders to get this to a point where we think it's ready. And the next available full board meeting is September 30th. So certainly we're working diligently towards that. But if further deliberations are needed, then certainly those could be accommodated. Just by way of housekeeping, if anybody's not talking, yes, there we go, keep yourselves on mute and feel free to unmute yourself at any point when you want to provide input. All right, let's get into the key issues. So a very short list of issues that we're looking to discuss with you today. Sometimes it's a laundry list of all sorts of things. Today it's fairly discrete. So rather than 100 slides, we've only got quite a few with a good amount of time to discuss. Essentially what we want to do is talk through how to set the baseline. We've got a couple of options built into the protocol at present that we've shared with you all, a static approach, also a dynamic approach. Also reflect back on leakage, another key area of the protocol, and then from there, and also throw it open to other points that folks would like to raise. We did receive a lot of good feedback from workgroup members on issues that aren't noted there, but in essence, we've worked closely with those folks, and we think that you know, we're in a pretty good position there, and we should be able to move forward easily. It's these other issues which we think is probably worth a good discussion, but certainly don't let that stop you from presenting other thoughts. All right, let's get into the meat of it. Baseline approaches. So before we get into a discussion, we thought it would be quite useful to reflect back on the context in which we find ourselves. So first we'll go for a little bit by way of regulatory background, and then also look at some changes within the industry itself, which provide quite critical background to where we find ourselves today. So in terms of the regulatory background, we know quite clearly and obviously to be expected that there's quite a different regulatory requirements in place for EU facilities than there are in the US. And then even with respect to the facilities within the US, there are quite different requirements on the two existing facilities in the US. One of those facilities has legal requirements to abate N2O, and the other facility does not have legal requirements to abate N2O. So that's quite critical, important background information that we should keep in mind while we're exploring these issues. Secondly, as you can see there, I think all the parties in the work group are aware that there's been some quite important changes within the industry itself. Very short summary there, that in essence, historically, there were 3 facilities operating in the US. There was a little bit of restructuring at some point, a bit of a bankruptcy, which no doubt potentially interrupted processes there and output, for instance. And in 2009, there was a change of ownership. And personally, I think probably most critically is that in 2015, one of those 3 facilities closed. And so production shifted to the other 2 facilities. During that time, market demand also increased. And then finally, by way of a little bit of production insight there, there's a 30% increase in production at one of those 2 facilities between 2015 and 2017. So I think we all know that levels of production have significant impact in the amount of abatement of N2O that goes on. So that context there provides very useful insight into understanding why the current conditions are very different from what we've seen historically, and also very different from what we see in other countries. Personally, I think for these reasons here, that period of 2015 through to the present is probably most reflective of current industry conditions. Just pause there and see if anybody wants to throw out any thoughts, and again, feel free to do so at any time. Plus, I'll have a sip of my tea. Okay, let's get into the static baseline options. What we have here on the slide is a little bit by way of a recap of what we presented to the work group back in April. A little bit of a summary of some of the feedback we got, and then moving forward to the current proposal that the reserve put to work group members during the last few months, as well as summarizing some of the feedback that we've received from the work group. So I'm going to pedantically go through these point by point, and again, feel free to reach out at any time if you want to start a discussion. So just by way of a reminder of what we had before, we came to the work group in April, and our suggestion was All right, we're ready to move forward with a 3-year average annual AE. In other words, use all available data points, develop annual average AE values for all 3 years, and then do a single average across those. We did get a good amount of workgroup feedback. Part of the feedback suggested that that's an insufficient historical period, unlikely to be representative. We also got a lot of feedback suggesting that we should really strive to look for something much more conservative than a 3-year average period. Some suggestions were that we could require using the highest AE value over shorter periods. That included perhaps monthly periods, weekly, etc. What we can tell you, having studied those alternatives, is that if we were to look at an average AE over much shorter periods much shorter than a year, we're going to quickly get AE values really close to 100%. And that text in red there just sort of highlights why that is the case and also why that might not be appropriate in the circumstances. In essence, what we've led to understand is that essentially the TRU, the unit that's used to abate N2O, is either on for long periods or it's off. And so if we try to distill an average AE over shorter periods, quite likely we're going to be capturing periods where this unit is simply on the whole time. And for that reason, the results will be skewed heavily towards 100%, especially if we're looking to pick the highest abatement efficiency over such a period. We're essentially going to be getting to 100% almost every time. We then turned around based on extensive discussions with the work group, and we've come back to the work group and said, all right, bit of a compromise. We can look at perhaps a 5-year average annual AE. So again, the same concept, using all available data points, develop annual average AE values for each of those 5 years prior to the start date, and then use an average of those. And again, we've been in multiple discussions with work group members, and we received somewhat similar feedback. Let's keep pushing for something even more conservative than an average, a simple average over those 5 years. And again, still some feedback suggesting that it's insufficient period of time. We should perhaps look to go further and further back. So just a little bit by way of reminder in terms of the structure of the industry. We think at the reserve that a 5-year period is probably as far back as we should go, noting that in 2015, there was the closure of one of the 3 facilities. And so that structural change in the industry essentially means that each of the remaining 2 facilities are likely to be producing at much higher levels. We know that's the case. That's coincided with increased market demand, it seems, so even more pressure to produce more. And we know, generally speaking, that with increased production, there's going to be a drop in abatement efficiency for N2O. So we think that 5-year period is probably as far back as we should go, given those circumstances. Now, some alternative proposals from workgroup members that we'll highlight at the bottom there. A couple of workgroup members suggested, what about we use the single highest annual average AE over that 5-year period? So sticking to the 5-year period, we think for reasons of the structure of the industry that that's appropriate. Well, let's push to be more conservative, and what about we grab the single annual AE that happens to be the highest in that period of time? And then the last point there, one workgroup member is encouraging us to go further back and try to be even more conservative, and in essence try to capture a lot more data and look as far back as we can. Might also be worth reflecting back on the fact that the unregulated facility in the US had also had an ownership change a few years back, so there's probably going to be some foreseeable significant challenges in being able to get data going back to the dawn of time. We can foresee that there's not going to be such finite, robust data stretching back, certainly back into pre-ownership, back into the bankruptcy period. Is probably a whole number of reasons why, beyond structural changes in the industry, why going further back is going to be a challenge. Let me stop there and see if our workgroup members would like to offer some thoughts at this point.
Hi, Sammy. It's Lauren from ClimbCo. I just want to echo that we think the 5-year average is a really, I think, appropriate choice in this case. As you mentioned, there's been some changes even within the last 5 years that I think make going back quite that far even a little bit conservative. So I think including those extra 2 years beyond the 3 should help make it capture those fluctuations that I know are of concern to some work group members. So I think this is in line with a lot of CAR's existing protocols. I went through and there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 or so that use a look back, and it's either 3 or 5, and I believe those are all averages. So I think this choice is in line with everything CAR has ever done, and also going to capture the market as appropriately as we can.
And I think, Sammy, this is Bill. Just to maybe touch upon, the one comment with respect to using perhaps a high abatement efficiency over that period of time, or looking at a shorter period. I think you summarized that well. The biggest challenge of facilities is to stay in compliance with their Clean Air Act permit, and N2O is not in the permit, right? NOx is, and so when they're abating NOx, they're not abating N2O. So to look at a short-term period where they could perhaps abate N2O for a period of time before they have to oscillate over to their NOx control system is really not representative of the average. So looking at an annual average is absolutely the way to go. There are significant investments being made to be able to increase that average AE over a period of time, which is obviously what the project is really focused on, is keeping that average up over a period of time, which includes massive investments into NOx removal, so we can fire the TRU more often, and ultimately do something which is incredibly novel, which isn't being done anywhere in the globe right now, to my knowledge, which is actually to take some of the N2O and convert it back into nitric acid. So not only is this investment, really meant to increase the efficiency and the uptime of the TRU, the conversion of N2O is what I get really excited about. Being in the N2O abatement space for over a decade in the United States, this is the first time I'm working with a technology that will actually, instead of oxidizing it into nitrogen and oxygen, will convert it back into nitric acid. So that's an added benefit.
Yes, appreciate those extra views there. Maybe just a quick point with respect to something Lauren said about baseline look-back periods. Certainly, you're right. We, stretching back 5 years is unusual for us, and stretching back further than that, I don't think we've done it. Not to my knowledge, but possible somewhere obscure. But having said that, what I can tell you is what's not always explicit is that sometimes we use baseline setting mechanisms as part of a broader additionality screen. So, usually we explicitly call out an additionality section and we do some sort of assessment of common practice or performance benchmarks. But we always also have other elements which do contribute towards that general concept of additionality. And those are usually buried in sometimes blunt eligibility criteria, which just says if you do this, you're in, if you don't, you're out. And sometimes also in the means by which we set the baseline. So I would suggest that in this particular instance, we can perhaps consider the baseline look-back period or the baseline mechanism in general as perhaps more conceptualize those a little bit as an additionality screen, a performance benchmark. In other words, we're having people at some point say, we should look at our friends in Europe and draw a line in the sand in terms of the average global production or adipic acid, abatement efficiency. We don't think that's an appropriate approach. But nonetheless, this type of baseline setting mechanism can perhaps be viewed within the broader context of trying to set an additionality, some sort of an additionality test.
So, Sammy, this is Seth.
Hey, Seth.
So I hear what you're saying, and I'm not sure which of the two workgroup members suggested the highest annual average. Maybe it was even me. I know we had this discussion a few months ago, but given the volume of credits that are being generated here and the sort of the small number of projects it's basically one project. I like the idea of sort of being conservative, and so the highest annual abatement efficiency over 5 years seems appropriate for a project like this. And I know to a certain extent we're getting into sort of the philosophical, but I could see where this type of project, given the volume and type project it is, it looks like it probably would be better to have to err on the side of being conservative. And so I think that given the variability that happens with abatement efficiencies based on the data I've seen, it does vary quite a bit it can vary quite a bit from year to year. That would just be at least I think one recommendation we should look at.
Yep. And just to add to that, I mean, I'm taking some notes over some meetings here. Looking at the variability from publicly available data before it became confidential in 2009, we ranged from 76% to 96% abatement efficiency in U.S. plants. And then 87% average over a pretty extended data set. And so the variability is, where there's no question they're investing in, and it seems that they're putting in better ways and better methods for abatement. But in the context of creating credits, you have to have a conservative baseline, and with the variability there, that's where some of the concerns have been. I know it's been expressed by the working group members by being and establishing one that is conservative, and with the variability of the abatement efficiency, that's the part that's difficult to pin down. And so, I think what Seth mentioned, this we're talking really about one plant here, which is a highly unusual case for a protocol. One protocol, one project. And granted, there's a lot of opportunity for reductions, which is great. But to pin down and make sure that this is, sustaining the integrity of CAR and the offset program there, as far as maintaining conservatism, I think that's just where we have some pause among some working group members to make sure that we're maintaining that. 76 range to a 96% abatement efficiency, it's just a lot. And if you put that in absolute volume, that's significant swing in reductions from over years of abatement. So with that said, I think that's one note that I had. Let's see. Conservative measures. We talked about the highest average baseline, or excuse me, highest average abatement efficiency over 5 years. That certainly goes into the direction of just simply taking an average over the 5 years, where you're accounting for not only a representation of the data set, over a period of time, but also taking a conservative stance. So without actually seeing the data, it's hard to tell, right? We're kind of talking about a black box here. So I know that there had been some requests from some working group members on, can we see the data? And you know, I don't know if that's possible, or if we can just review the data and that way we know what we're talking about. And so I'll just leave it at that. Comments. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe just quickly on that. Oh, sorry, Anne, go ahead.
I guess I would just, you know, yeah, I appreciate the comment on conservatism, Seth. My only thought here is that I know you got that the public data is based on all of the facilities in the United States, and there is this situation where one facility is facing, I believe they have the BACT requirements for abating N2O. So some of those data are caught in there. So basing a baseline based on kind of the thought that these levels are being achieved when one of them is facing regulatory requirements, it's kind of I don't think that's the right way to look at it. And if they're using their actual data, the 5-year average should capture the ups and downs. That's, you know, the definition of average. I guess that's just what I wanted.
I guess, you know, if you had a wide range of abatement efficiencies, and I haven't seen the data for this one specific plant, you know, if you start your project 1 year and the last 5 years had a, you know, a really low abatement efficiency 1 year, and then if you had started the project a year later or a year before, a year later, and then that was an outlier year that is no longer, you can see how you can get a situation where the baseline can change quite a bit depending on even when you start the project. So again, I just haven't seen the data for the one plant that we're really talking about. I've only seen sort of the generally publicly available data. So I get a little nervous that the baseline could be 87%. It could be 91%. It could be, you know, it just seems, and given the volume that we're talking about here of credits, it could swing pretty wildly, not, you know, significantly, let's say, depending on factors that, you know, maybe aren't intended, you know, the way the protocol is written currently.
Maybe a couple comments from me then on that as well. This is Bill. You know, I think obviously as we touched upon the amount of TRU utilization is certainly, I think Sammy did a nice job. You know, really is tied to production levels. You know, so imagine if you owned a facility and your highest abatement efficiency was during your lowest production year, and you really wanted to achieve that level of destruction of N2O during high production years, and you want to invest significant capital to do that. And then somebody tells you, well, thanks for the investment of the capital, but none of that really matters, you know, because we're only looking at one data point, which says, hey, during that really low production year or during a lower production year, you were able to abate more. We realized that during the high production years, you abated less. And thanks for doing this voluntarily and investing millions of dollars to do this, but we're not going to give you credit for that. You know, I think we're just letting the process get in the way of success for the environment. And I think the one thing that I hear so often on this protocol type is volumes. You know, I heard it from two workgroup members so far, concern over volume. So I guess what I'm hearing that if this was a smaller landfill project, this concern wouldn't be valid because the volumes are lower. And I think that pushes to the integrity of some of the comments, because I think we're more concerned about volume than we are the integrity of the program and following CAR procedures. And that's actually really troubling. You know, in the nitric acid space, they don't have any control. And when we install N2O abatement systems at nitric acid facilities, there's 0% abatement as the baseline, just like there was in the adipic acid world pre-Kyoto. You know, the projects that World Bank was investing in had 0% control on adipic acid, and they thought that projects were wonderfully additional. You know, so if we look at the same logic, one would say, you know, the nitric acid plants, because they don't have any control, is, you know, should they get credit for installing abatement and destroying 80%? You know, so it really causes me to pause a bit when I hear so much of the comments around concern over volume.
Yeah. So just to add some color there, you know, the volumes it's not the there's no one questioning whether or not this is moving in the right direction, but the questioning is, what is the true reductions that are happening above what would have happened otherwise, right? And how is that being credited? And with respect to the volumes, essentially someone's going to be using this to offset emissions. And so for them to have a true additional offset and having the, a sheer, amount of volume that would be offset for those emissions, the buyers of those offsets need to know that these are above and beyond what would have happened in a business as usual scenario. So I think the comment there on volume is just to make sure that the amount of impact this would have if we're crediting too much volume that's not representative of a truly with high integrity offset project from one project, right? And so we're talking about one project, not multiple projects, where in most programs there's in many cases at least 20, 30 projects that participate, at least in some of the larger sector protocols that actually generate credits today. That's where it's concerned, and then being able to point to one project and what that could mean if we're not getting. So I think that's where we come in. It's not a matter of if we should limit just because they could create a large volume. It's a matter of getting the marginal above the baseline right in a case where it seems there's a lot of variability, and the standard deviation could be very high based on some of the data we've seen. And we haven't seen, we don't know what that data is. It's just from what data we do have to us, it seems like it's very highly variable.
I might just jump in quickly on data availability. I don't mean to disrupt the discussion, but one of the core challenges that we're facing is we've got two facilities operating in the US since 2015. One of them is legally required to abate certain amounts of N2O. And so really, ideally, if we had all the data we wanted, what we should really focus in on is how much N2O at the facility that's subject to a legal mandate is being abated above those legally mandated levels. And that's not going to be possible to do. And it's really only that amount of N2O which is being voluntarily abated by the second facility, as well as all of the N2O that's been abated by the facility that has no legal mandate. That's really what we should focus in on, is if we were data rich, when we should exclude any N2O that's been legally mandated to be destroyed by one of those facilities. That's certainly how we would do it on the landfill side. We'd be very careful to sort of go in, and when we're creating any sort of additionality threshold, we would be careful to exclude landfills that are subject to mandates from any such analysis. Unfortunately, here we're not going to be able to get that data, which is putting us in a bit of a challenging position. But I'll stop there.
So just for the record, I totally agree with that comment. It should be representative of the project, but the variability that I'm hearing from the one project that would likely participate in this is still high too. It can go as high as 98%. It can go as low as from what I've heard, as low as below 80%. And we don't know that. We haven't seen the data. It's a black box. So.
Seth, was the 98%, was that for the specific facility, or was that aggregate data for the United States?
No. I mean, I was told that just recently, just on this call, that if you use certain days, certain years, or even certain data sets, that you could go as high as as almost 100%.
Okay. So I guess to kind of clarify the operations, because I think this point is sometimes hard to convey. The abatement equipment, the TRU, it's either on or it's off. And when the equipment's on, it is going to be abate 100% of the time, or 99.99, whatever the efficiency of the equipment is, which is almost 100%. And when it's off, it's 0. So anytime that you're calculating some kind of average, it's basically just a series of ones and zeros that you're finding an average over. So I think the point Sammy was saying, that if you look at a week and say we're gonna take weekly data, it's very likely that it might be on for an entire week. So it's not a matter of that in reality, it's that variable. It's a matter of that for this type of on or off situation, you need some amount of data for it to be, I guess, logical, right? If it's on for 2 months and then off for a month and then on for 2 months, if you just look at 1 month, you're not going to get a representative sample.
Right.
Totally agree with that, but
Yeah.
just making sure that we're capturing that you're still talking about within the atmosphere. You have an output of some size when it's off, and an output of some size when it's on.
Mm-hmm.
And to be able to capture that, what we're trying to define as a conservative baseline is to have a representative sample and data set that can capture that. So while you could just say you capture, a year's worth or a week's worth, that just captures it being on 100%. On the flip side, you could capture just a time period of which that it's down the whole time, right? So I think the only point that people are, the working groups are making is we don't know what the variability is. We don't know how often it's on and off. And to be able to apply a statistical approach that's conservative, that's what we're trying to get to.
Mm-hmm.
And it's difficult to do without knowing that, that is or without seeing that. So.
I might offer a couple of quick thoughts about some of the figures that have been put out as well. We had mentioned previously that there was, possibly 97, 98% abatement levels historically, whether it was this facility or other facilities. And based on the information that's available to me, I can say that I believe at some point the collective abatement efficiency of all 3 facilities in the US may have gone up to 96 based on the information I've seen, which was essentially, I think, distilled from the US EPA's report to UNFCCC. So what we should remember is two key points, I think. 2 out of those 3 facilities, or at least 1, to my knowledge, was legally mandated to abate. But then also the fact that there was 3 facilities would imply lower production levels at each of those relative to production levels at 2 facilities. And therefore, there's going to be sort of different pressure or different ability to abate in other words, unfortunately, if we go back before 2015, there's some very strong rationale for why that data is not representative of what we see going forward. And I can tell you that any values in those high 90s were from pre-2015 data. Data from 2015 onwards at the national level is not available to my knowledge, unfortunately, or not in that format.
So I'm sorry, Sammy, you're saying that from 2015 to the present, the average abatement efficiencies are all pretty high? Did I get that? Did I understand that correctly?
No, that could be an inference that we draw, but what I can tell you is I've seen the data before 2015, and it's during that period before 2015 when that 96 value for the average AE across all 3 facilities came up. And I believe that was the reference that our colleague Lambert had referred to previously. In fact, he sort of shared that with me recently. So I was trying to put in context this notion that there might be a bunch of high 90 AEs out there. Just want to make it clear that yes, there are instances where there was a 96% abatement efficiency annual value. However, just to clarify, that was across all 3 facilities, and that was a good number of years ago. That's the point I was trying to make. Going forward from 2015 forward, that data is not available in that format.
Oh, I see. Okay, so we don't know what the abatement efficiency levels have been since 2015.
I certainly have not been able to see that data. It's not available at the federal level. So what we're left with is, I don't believe we will be able to get such data.
I think this was, I don't know if it's worthy, Seth, to know, but I think it was in the issues paper that Lauren put together. We did FOIA through the Freedom of Information Act, the Title V operating permit of the other facility, and they could certainly apply this protocol. to abate above the regulatory limit, but they have 2 regulatory limits, and it was based on a consent agreement. So they have N2O in their Title V operating permit, which is why it's not a valid data point. But they agreed in a consent agreement to a 90% or a 95% abatement, depending on the control logic that they're using. So we do have that outlier there that, again, obviously nobody does a consent agreement unless they're a bad actor in some other manner and they're negotiating a payment or settlement. So they negotiated a settlement that had N2O as a requirement. But it is between 90 and 95% as a requirement, whereas obviously the other facility that's supporting this, was always a good actor and a steward to the environment, and that doesn't have any requirement, so, it kind of reminds me of, again, with no incentives in the United States, imagine a facility abating over 80% on average voluntarily. It's amazing, and then we're trying to improve it on a steady state fashion to get up to higher levels on average on an annual basis. And all the comments that I'm hearing about the dynamic nature of this is, production is dynamic, and I'm certain that going back 5 years grabs a lot of those ups and downs and is a true representative of the average that we want to improve upon. So I think we have it nailed.
Yeah, I think that's a good point to reflect back on. That we certainly do have a great opportunity here. We should recognise that any abatement whatsoever at this one facility is above what's legally required, and we have a significant opportunity to increase that further. But obviously we should do so while respecting those core principles of offsets, including the desire to always be conservative within reasonable bounds. But yeah, I appreciate that, Seth.
Yeah, just the add, I mean, from a statistical approach and perspective, just taking an average at times at a high variability and high standard deviation doesn't really get the 95th, UCL or the mean in some cases, right? And so there's tests that you can put forward to actually, in cases where you have high variability or high standard deviation, to capture what truly is, what truly is the mean, but rather than just taking a simple average. Two, we're trying to be conservative here as well, and so that it's not that I think that working group members don't want there to be a limit necessarily on what can be achieved here. It's just that if there's a high level of variability and without actually seeing what's coming from the facility, there's the concern that, and there will be a focus on whether or not the reductions are representative of above and beyond a business as usual scenario. And just another comment too, the voluntary nature of this plant going above and beyond what they're required to do is great, but in the framework of all other offset protocols, you use landfill as an example. If you were doing a flare or an inactive passive flare prior to implementing your project, you don't get credits for that because that's not part of the baseline of registering your project. You have to get to a point where what's above and beyond even what you voluntarily have done to capture what is the project activity in this case is actually reducing. And so that's inherent to any protocol where we're trying to define the baseline. It's just this baseline is there's just a concern of what is truly the baseline, and does an average over 5 years really reflect that if the data set is highly variable?
This is Seth, and at the risk of beating a dead horse, I would just say that I think if there is high variability in the 5-year period, there is some inherent ambiguity or uncertainty about what would actually happen in the future without this project. And it's a very common thing in the carbon world to, in the face of uncertainty or some ambiguity, to err on the side of being conservative. And maybe there's some middle ground here where, if the variability is very narrow within the 5-year period, to use the average, and if the variability is very high within that 5-year average, then you take the most conservative option. I'm trying to think of ways to get past this, but that's one thing we can talk about. But overall, I think it's a pretty established principle, particularly in the CDM. I've been involved in a number of these discussions and methodologies where you kind of have to err on being conservative and risk undercrediting, but doing it with absolute total integrity and certainty that these emission reductions are above and beyond. So, well, I'll leave it at that.
I mean, wasn't it the CDM that allowed 0% baseline control, Seth, on adipic acid projects initially?
Yeah, and I think that caused a whole lot of problems. But
I was on a project where World Bank in 2012 invested in a Brazil site that generated 42 million tons because they wanted to see the project continue to go forward without them shutting down their TRU. That was a great example of a site that the World Bank thought highly of, that had 0% control as a baseline. And here in the U.S., we had no incentives like that, and we have facilities that are doing it voluntarily at a really high level. And so I still come down to thinking about the variability is a good comment, and certainly I've never been on a protocol process where I've seen process data, but I've never been on from unique facilities during the protocol approval process. But yet this is a unique situation that we're all aware of, that we're writing a protocol really for the use by one or maybe two facilities. So I understand that, but I think, there's no doubt that TRU uptime is related to, three main things: NOx levels, compliance with the Clean Air Act, production levels, and then ultimately TRU downtime. These assets are old, just like they were in the CDM days, where they actually installed a parallel TRU as a backup because it's aged equipment. That this facility, the TRU, is well over 20 years old, with no mandate to upgrade it, because all it does is destroy voluntary gas of N2O. So as these assets get older, TRU uptime also decreases just with TRU issues. So it's TRU, NOx, and production levels. And certainly I believe that since the production shifted in 2015, all of the questions about, concerns over the data, going back that extra 2 years to a 5-year, which I don't think CARS, like Sammy said, has ever gone beyond, is really more than adequate. I really don't think that that there's a better approach, but that's my view.
Can we maybe circle back to the idea that Seth put out, that perhaps we could explore using annual average over a 5-year period with some caveats? One caveat being that if circumstances changed in the given year such that it was the change was statistically significant, and therefore we would not use such an annual average baseline. Can we have a bit more discussion on that and maybe get some feedback from other workgroup members about that idea? Because it's something we haven't explored before, I don't think.
Well, I think what was thrown around, I don't know if what my understanding from the discussion so far was discussed is that there is a way to capture, if there is variation, to apply some conservative measure if there's high variation. So for an example, and I'm just thinking out loud here, right? So if there is a standard deviation that is 2 or 3, right? And over the sample set or the sample size, then in a conservative way, you could essentially say if it's 2 or 3 on plus or minus 2 or 3, then you would add 2 or 3 points or percentage points on top based on that standard deviation to be conservative. That's just an idea, but it's difficult to say that without actually seeing the data. So that's just one idea thrown out. The other idea would be I think what was said is if you use the highest of the average years over the 5-year period, that's more of a broad brush approach. using a statistical method, that beyond just using the 5-year average, which can, if there's high variability, I want to be clear, in the statistical approach, that doesn't capture the true mean of that data set. If there's high variability, especially if it's binary 0 and 1. So I'll just make that comment.
So this is Seth. I mean, when I threw out that idea, I was admittedly just sort of off the top of my head. I mean, I suppose you could do it something where if you use the average of the 5 years, if the variability is within a few percentage points, and then if the variability exceeds that, like 10 percentage points or whatever it is, then you use the highest or the average of the highest 2 years or something like that. Admittedly, I'm just thinking about this off the cuff here. So but that might be a way to work through this somehow.
Mhm. So my question, I suppose, goes to Sammy. This is, I think either Seth or John talked about it, or Jonathan talked about it earlier, alluding to the fact that we're getting into a bit of a philosophical debate over how to define conservativeness and baseline. Would it be, at the end of the day, CAR will see the data. So would it not be CAR's role to review the data for the appropriateness of using a mean versus another method? So I guess I would toss that to you, Sammy.
Yes, absolutely. But if there's no mechanism built into the protocol to require us to study the appropriateness and then have options to do something about it, then it's perhaps a moot point. In other words, if we hardwire a specific approach, we look at the data and we see that there's philosophical problems with applying said approach. If we have nothing to do with, no options to deal with such philosophical problems, then we'll be stuck with it.
Can I ask the question? Is it I know a couple of working group members requested to see the data. Is that feasible? Can that be done as we know, from one facility? I mean, we have really one project that's likely to participate. Is that available to the working group members?
I can say that the reserve has seen some data, and what I can also say is that if we're lucky to get this protocol up and running and we have projects submitted, then absolutely we would expect such data to be presented to us. We would study it closely, and also the third-party independent verifier under contract would be studying the data closely. As to availability of data for the work group to study, I believe we're not able to access such data at this point due to confidentiality concerns, I would imagine.
Okay.
Maybe just a couple of quick words on that point. I think, if there's only 2 facilities in the country, having access to robust data sets would potentially foreseeably pose problems for the given facility. Looks like Craig's joined us. Hi, Craig. Thanks for joining.
Good day.
Just test your audio. Yeah, there we go. Good. Thanks, Craig.
Yeah, I think when we look back in data, I think the one thing that is always interesting in a look back like this, for 5 years, is that certainly over the last 5 years, there is no plan on doing an N2O abatement project like this, until, the leadership of Ascend stepped up after they acquired the facility and looked at, where they wanted to make investments into sustainability. And I think, when I look back at the data, obviously, there's a couple of important factors with respect to production. Nobody ever produced historically to create a baseline of N2O. In fact, they voluntarily abated N2O. And, I always look back at production and I say, was the facility within their production window, within their Clean Air Act operating permit? And certainly this facility always has been. So they've always operated based on the size of the equipment, market demands, within their Title V operating permit, never to set a baseline. It wasn't even envisioned then. So, again, when I look back at the data since the production shift in 2015, to the two assets in the United States, I still come back to the most credible approach is an average. I understand the concern about variability, but imagine if, variability occurs in all of our businesses. There are times when we're not producing as much. But again, if they didn't produce as much adipic acid, it wasn't to try to jack up their TRU utilization because they could use it more when they produce less. It was based on market demands. And I think that's what we need to keep into consideration here when we're thinking about how to create an average baseline.
Yeah, thanks for that,
History
Bill.
does indicate what the future will look like. Certainly does.
Perhaps at this point, and for the benefit of Craig as well, it might be worth just going back over and summarising some of the discussion we've had over the last hour. And please feel free to jump out if I'm mischaracterising or if I missed something. But in essence, what we've distilled in on is the two options that we've talked about here, which is the proposal in the middle there, current proposal, using a 5-year average, using annual AE. And then we've also been discussing the second dot point, second to last from the bottom, proposed by a couple of workgroup members to use single highest annual AE over the 5-year period. And then we've had a little bit of a discussion of perhaps a mechanism to oscillate between the two. Perhaps we can use the proposal in the middle from the reserve there, a simple average, unless the specific abatement efficiency in the given year of the project varies too significantly, in which case maybe we sort of revert back to something slightly more conservative, something closer to either using the single highest annual average over the 5-year period or something of that nature. That's, I think, perhaps a summary of the key points we seem to be circling around.
Sammy, sorry, this is Phil. I just had a quick question. I'm a little confused. If when the TRU is on, why would you pick the single highest point over 10 years? Won't that just be 100% abatement? Where am I confused? Thanks.
Well, yeah, no, good question. Good question. So that's why we're strongly recommending against anything shorter than essentially an average over a year. In other words, let's take every single data point from the year and let's average the abatement efficiency over that period. And then let's compare those annual averages. So that would create a bit more of a representative average rather than a more finite period, which is going to be much more variable. So the variability in annual averages is much, much less than the variability in averages over shorter periods, which will be essentially a bunch of 100s and then periods that are much lower.
And then, maybe to add to that, Sammy, like why a year? Well, I mean, they're complying with a NOx limit. That's an annual NOx limit in their Clean Air Act Title 5 operating permit. So they're operating this to come into compliance with that on an annual basis. So, a year average on N2O also makes perfect sense.
Yeah, that's very useful. Thanks for that. Yeah, go ahead.
So just to ask, I mean, if we're, again, there's statistical tests that can be done to capture, there's 95th UCL, 95% upper confidence limit that tries to capture the variability using standard deviations. I saw that in the dynamic baseline. I didn't see it in the static. Is there a reason why we're not using that more, arguably more robust method of defining what that mean could be? From there, then you could see that can capture some of the variability, and then when beyond at that point, you could apply some conservative measure as need be. So that's just a question. I mean, there's other tests that can be done, and not to make it this a process of complex statistics. but you do have the 95th UCL and other protocols, and also in the dynamic baseline. Why is that not being? Why wasn't that considered in the static?
John, do you know of statistical tests that are appropriate for percentage data like that? Because
now you're asking me to go back to my statistical days. There is. I can certainly, go back and look, but there are some that exist. One appropriate one, and one that's used widely, including by the reserve, is 95th UCL. That incorporates variation and standard deviation. So,
yeah, my only concern with that is that, and again, this is also stretching my statistical knowledge. Either we're looking at 5 data points, which calculating a standard deviation off 5 data points is always kind of iffy from a sample size perspective, or we're looking at this kind of series of zeros and ones and trying to get variability out of that using standard methods is, I don't think you can use standard statistical tests. And I tried to find some on, did a little bit of research to see what is appropriate for that kind of data. And I was struggling. So if you have suggestions.
Well, so can I add, and this comes back to I haven't seen the data, so it's a little difficult to approach it. So, but if you're using a 5-year data set, right? And you're right, the larger, like in any statistics, the larger the data set, the more appropriate it will be and more robust it will be. So if you're using the 5-year, raw data set, you could, and I don't know what it looks like and how widely it varies, but you could essentially apply it that way. And you're right, if it's in some cases, and I'd have to again go back and look at these tests, it's more appropriate to use other tests that have even a higher degree of variability. But what is not appropriate times, and I do know this, is that if you have a high level of variability and it is not a stream consistent line of data that does not vary very much, an average would be appropriate in that case. But to take a simple average with a high variability does not capture the true mean of that data set.
And I think, variability in these data sets, especially with the up and down of the TRU, not only for NOx compliance, but also just for maintenance upgrades, that it's very dynamic. So, the correlations are tough. And, we did look at the data and, on an average basis, I think that's one way to manage it appropriately. But imagine a data set where you may have all of these moving parts that I described, production, NOx limits, TRU utilization. It's a lot of data points that move, and at the end of the day, it's tough to have correlations, tight correlations.
Perhaps we can go on and talk a little bit about the dynamic approach, because we seem to be getting into some such discussions anyway, and we can always come back to this static perhaps once we've looked at both. Does that sound reasonable to folks if we move on to the next slide and start talking about some of those correlations that were attempted to be put together? Any objections?
Not for me.
Okay. So let's do the same again. Let's do a bit of a recap of what we came up with, presented in April, some of the feedback and what the changes that we've done in response. So to recap, again, it was this notion of a 3-year average using annual AE values. In other words, using all available data points over that 3-year period. From there, the idea was the project developer themselves would develop a correlation analysis. We didn't specify statistical significance, although we would say that's implied. There was also flexibility to allow the project developer themselves to set the period of time over which the correlation could be developed. And then clearly the reserve would study closely whatever that analysis was, and it would require reserve approval in writing before a project could use it. We can tell you that our friends at Climco attempted to put together just such a correlation, as Lauren described, and Bill as well, and was not able to do so, meeting the statistical level, the level of statistical significance that the reserve was advocating for. So that just, again, speaks to some of the challenges there with respect to using those different statistical analysis techniques for demonstrating sufficient correlation. Nonetheless, we did take that approach out to the work group and got some feedback. Some general feedback was, let's include this type of analysis if possible. Certainly would be valuable to have it there, and we've heard similar comments today. We weren't able to see it successfully employed, but it should be there as a default option perhaps for future use. Some further feedback: we should not allow the project developer to set the period of time over which correlation is developed. There was a lot of thinking that that could allow for gaming. The underlying rationale was due to the variability in data, the more flexibility, the better chance we have of coming up with something that's useful. Not able to do so thus far. Nonetheless, that was feedback that we received. A couple of other points there. Yes, dynamic option would be good to keep. Designate a specific period of time over which the correlation is developed. Hey, I put that there twice, excuse me. Specify the statistical significance for correlation, so be explicit about it. And again, expand the historical period over which the correlation is assessed. So just quickly down the bottom there, sure, we took on board that feedback. We're now moving it from a 3-year to a 5-year period. We've been explicit about the statistical significance for the correlation, and we would propose to fix the period over which the correlation is developed. Most likely quarterly will be the only option that's sensible and it could work. And then the only other point that was suggested, which we think there's wide support for, is to not allow a project to go from the dynamic back to the static baseline, because that would allow for perhaps some cherry picking. So the notion there would be, if you move to a dynamic approach, you would have to stick with that approach for the rest of the crediting period. I would imagine that could run some risk that it might not be feasible to do so in a given year, but nonetheless, that's the feedback that we've received. So let me stop there and see if people want to pick up the discussion about using different statistical approaches here.
Sammy, this is Seth. I have a question. Does the current proposal envision a similar requirement that the reserve approve in writing any kind of analysis? And if so, my other two questions are: is there precedent for that in other protocols? I suspect there is. And two, is there any guidance that the protocol should give to the reserve when approving or not approving particular analyses?
Good questions. So in terms of setting a baseline, I suspect probably not, but we do have a general approach where specifically for quantification, also for monitoring when we're pulling together various data sets, we often have flexibility, whether it's through a formal variance process or otherwise, sometimes in exceptional circumstances, where we allow projects to come up with an alternative methodology, pitch it to us. What we typically do is we pull in external expertise as available. For instance, we might go out to a verifier and have them confirm that what's been proposed makes sense, and then we study it closely ourselves, and then ultimately the decision falls on the shoulder of the reserve to accept it or request modifications, etc. So in that broader context, yes, we do this quite often, where we might expect to study analyses closely and make a determination as to whether we think it's reasonable or not in the full circumstances.
And the current proposal would, you would still have this reserve would have to approve in writing
Yes.
the correlation note. Okay.
Yes.
And I'm just wondering if the protocol should specify, I don't know exactly what the guardrails would be, but some sort of guardrails for the reserve, to approve or not approve the analysis. Then I just maybe throw that out to the group. But thanks for answering my question.
I mean, so we will hardwire in a specific level of statistical significance. Do you have any other specific thoughts, guardrails?
I'm thinking about it right now. I'll let you know if I come up with anything right now. But I mean, just in general, sort of if there are any risks of selectively taking data that makes the baseline look better from an emissions credits generation perspective, to guard against that somehow. I don't know. I'll give it some thought here while we're talking.
Yeah, good point. So setting the period over time, the period over which the correlation is developed, all of these small points are contributing towards that general thinking. But also specific requirements for when data can be excluded or included. I think there's probably several ways that we do that we've already, talked over on this meeting, but also more broadly. Specifying which data must be included, specifying the period over which the analysis must be done, specifying a level of statistical significance that must be demonstrated. And then generally speaking, clearly we're not in the business of just sort of handing out lollipops willy-nilly. The reserve tends to be one of the most conservative registries relative to our peers, certainly historically. So, I think our inclination would certainly be to look at such analysis carefully and make sure we're comfortable with it. Any other thoughts? We could take it back to the previous slide too, if folks want to fall back on the discussion of the static approach and take that further. Okay.
It seems to me that, if I don't know, we're talking about one project here, so there's, maybe two, but one project is going to pick one of the others, right? So either the static or dynamic. Based on what I see here, it seems like it's not feasible to find a correlation, so that static is probably going to be the more focused area of application. So I'll just make that comment. Two, I just wanted to make this too. I know there was some discussion around data, and we talked about the European facilities under the CDM and JI, or joint implementation. There was a lot of history behind that. We talked about it on these calls, and where we are today. And I think what Lambert tried to express too is that they've put in a lot of provisions and safeguards and rails to make sure that any adipic acid facility that's generating credits is doing so within a conservative and high integrity program. And part of that process, what they did was they made all the facilities under those programs made their data public, right? And then in this case, we can't do that. And I understand based on what you've told me that it's confidential. But that was part of that process of developing a program that now today safeguards from what the black eye that it once had, with generating offsets beyond what was the baseline or business as usual. So just making that comment here, I mean, it seems like there's a little bit of struggle on, based on the data set, the high variability, applying a correct statistical approach, and making sure that we capture the true baseline here as best we can using the techniques that we have available to us without making it overcomplicated. That we kind of we pull the book off the shelf of what happened previously, where data was actually shown, and we were able to determine, kind of based upon what all the players who would be participating would be determining that appropriate method. And so I'm just a little concerned based on not knowing the level of complexity and the data set and how highly it varies, and making sure that we're focusing on the critical path here, which sounds like it's the static baseline, that we're applying the appropriate measures.
Maybe this is Bill, just a couple comments. I think those are good points, John. I think on the dynamic, I would certainly say that the dynamic, if correlation existed, would be something that could be really attractive. And I think, some of the best statisticians that we know have looked at the data, and I understand you haven't, but certainly if we could have a model that says, if we're producing below our allowable limit, but we're producing at higher volumes, if historically our baseline efficiency was in the 70% at that level, that should be our baseline at that production level. And an analogous situation would be if we're at a lower production, then our efficiency or our TRU uptime should be at a higher level. I mean, I think that ideally is something that we would love to see. Now, the work group members may not like it, because then you may have a dynamic model that says, at my higher production levels, my baseline is 75%. I think it's, so, when that model doesn't work, we still like that option, because I'm hoping that we can get statistical data to support it and get an R-squared value that is really tight, and then that would make sense to us. We like that. I think a static is actually a big concession, because everybody thinks that this isn't conservative, but at high production levels or at medium production levels, we could definitely be in a situation where the dynamic would have created many more credits than what we're going to get with the static. So it's hard for you to see that because you're not seeing the data, but I would say that there's a lot of conservativeness built into the static, and the dynamic would have been something that we would have really supported, and we still hope to support, if we can get a correlation that we're all comfortable with. So, and then I think on the baselines internationally, after 15 years of abating N2O from Adipic, it's great to have a baseline of 90% after 15 years of incentive. If we use that same approach with a lot of the project types that CAR supports in the US, our baselines wouldn't look anything like they look like now. Landfill would be a great example. That it would be much different. We wouldn't be able to get credit for a lot of the landfill projects that we have if we looked at international benchmarks. And I think that's where I struggle. I struggle by taking a market that had 15 years of incentive, and I think the paper the Stockholm Institute wrote that we reference in our background document was a great paper, because there was a couple facilities where they shifted production, and so it did happen. So I think a lot of the issues that I think Lambert had, speaking on behalf of SEI, had to do with more leakage issues that we haven't even touched on the call today. But I feel really confident that we don't have those same leakage concerns here as well. So, but yeah, I mean, I appreciate your viewpoint, John.
Yeah, and just to add to that, understood that there's a different, there's different operation levels, and we're in a different place here in the U.S. versus Europe. Totally get that. There's different history associated with that. But what my only point was that the struggle here, it seems, is that there's no transparency to the data, where there's one facility that's likely to participate. And if you look at the history of what happened internationally, what they did and to solve this issue after there was, the speculation and issues with, you mentioned leakage is one, is that all of the facilities made their data available, right? So there was full transparency, and from there they applied revisions to the methodology that applied. And so that's the only point I wanted to make, is that if we truly, it's just difficult for the working group members to apply a fair baseline, one that could very well achieve high volume, which would be great, right? But without seeing it, we're kind of shooting in the dark a little bit. So,
on that note, it might be worth reflecting back on the different roles that we use a work group for relative to what the CDM might use in development of some of their protocols. So in our program, the most useful way that we make use of work group is to draw on your specific expertise. What we don't then do is put your names out there as parties that have endorsed the methodology, so to speak. And we know other programs do that. They express it explicitly in those terms. So that's perhaps a little bit of a subtle difference in our programs. We're inviting you all today, and we try to bounce ideas off you and elicit your explicit feedback on those, especially where you're expert in those concepts. So perhaps takes a little bit of pressure off your shoulders, and then we can fall back and tell you that at the reserve we certainly have seen some data, and so it puts us in a position where we're able to be a bit more confident in saying that we've studied material available to us and we think X approach or Y approach is appropriate. So certainly, John, we recognise it puts you in an awkward position where you're not able to come forward with such certainty and make such judgments, but we're in a different boat here in terms of reserve staff. But let me pause there, see if there's other thoughts with respect to additionality. Just do a quick time check. We've got half an hour left. Additionality baseline, sorry. It might be worth moving on to just touch on the leakage piece. I think it's a much simpler piece here, given we've worked extensively with Lambert, and there seems to be relative consensus through the work group on that. And then we can perhaps come back to this baseline issue. But let me pause there. Any further thoughts at this point on baselines, and we can certainly come back to it in a moment again.
Not particularly, Sammy, but I guess I will just echo what you said about, CAR will see the data, the third party verifier will see the data, and if we can put in place thoughtful statistical tests, something we can think about. But I think, the reserve part of your role is to review the appropriateness of the baseline, and maybe if we put that in some language explicitly about that, that might be helpful.
And just to be clear, is that understanding that the data would be made available before the protocol was adopted to CAR, or are we talking about upon verification?
The latter. We have seen some data, but I don't think that there's a explicit undertaking that we would need to see a complete, finite, entire SEMS data set before we move forward.
Oh, okay. Just to be clear, I wasn't clear there. Is this before? So you're saying that now there's a request to see it before we actually establish a baseline or adopt a protocol?
No, we've put multiple requests for data. Thus far, we have seen some aggregated data. We are not saying that we are refusing to move forward without a complete SEMS minute-by-minute data set. That's not our position.
Okay. That's the only point. And the point I'm trying to is, if we're going to establish a baseline without the governing body of registry, that would be, just a point of concern. Yeah.
Yeah, noted. I mean, it might also be worth stepping back and just acknowledging that quite often baselines are a counterfactual hypothetical. So this notion that we can dial in something that's exact and we know that it's correct or incorrect is not always such an apt characterization. All right, let's hit leakage, and then again we can come back and talk about our favorite issue in just a moment. It's been a really useful discussion, so I greatly appreciate everybody contributing in this fashion. Leakage. This fairly high level summary here, but definitely, let us know if you want to talk through specifics. So in essence, in the previous proposal, let's see, require max production be fixed at the facility permitted production level. We had some good feedback, not to name names, but we had one colleague in particular that was heavily focused on leakage, and some of the feedback was quite interesting. First of all, this would not be good enough to exclude some of the sort of problems that we might have seen in the CDM, where you could still see production shift from facilities in other parts of the world to the US facility, and it could be that emissions increase as a result of that. So that's something that we should still guard against. Something like a simple limit based on the permitted production limit would not safeguard us against some of the worst problems that we've seen in this sector. Second point though, going in the other direction, assuming that first issue didn't occur, this type of a limit would be unnecessarily restrictive on a given facility. And if that first sort of migration of production due to offsets is not happening, then we shouldn't be restricting production. We should let them move with the market demand. So the third dot point, instead do this. The idea was a little bit challenging for us to sort of get comfortable with, but we think it's probably feasible. We've shopped it around to the rest of the work group, and thus far the consensus seems to be that this could very well work, is that we could require something by way of a study of factory loading at a given project facility, and then compare that to what we're seeing at other facilities. And if we see that drop somewhere else and it suddenly spikes at the project, then that would be a sign that that first dot point, that risk has been realized, that production has shifted, driven to some degree by offsets being issued to this one facility. And so this sort of a study would allow us to eliminate that and to otherwise leave the project unfettered to increase production as demand dictated. So in other words, if all ships rise together, that's no problem. It's only if we see production move from one facility, most likely Eastern Europe or Asia, to here, where the production abatement efficiencies are different, that we would be worried. Again, this seems to have the support of the most, the work group member that's most focused on this, and we've shopped it around to other work group members, and I think we didn't really see any ongoing feedback that changes were needed. But let me stop there and see if folks want to offer some thoughts.
This is Seth. For this proposal, in terms of the data from other global facilities, is that data definitively available for every plant in the world?
That was our specific area of concern, and what we've been led to believe is that there should be availability of such data. Most likely it would have to be paid for by research firms, and the parties providing us this type of guidance suggested that they had acquired such data in the past. It might be slightly dated. We can expect it's not going to be up to the minute. It might be several years old, but that data should be available to allow us to conduct this type of assessment.
And would this leakage analysis be done every year? In
Yes.
which case, if you're using data that's several years old, is that problematic in some way? I'm not saying I'm opposed to this. I'm just asking questions.
Sure, certainly. To have finite data that's available up to the minute would be much better. We're talking about highly hypothetical scenarios, which are very, very unlikely to occur. We're not in a CDM here. We're in the US. We don't think this is going to occur at all. Available data is going to be limited. Nonetheless, we've got some fairly cumbersome tools that we can work with to address a very hypothetical very unlikely scenario. If you have thoughts as to something more robust, certainly we'd be happy to explore it. We think, in essence, this will nonetheless provide us with the ability to see if there are changes that are significant enough that could cause a worry here.
Yeah, I'm just thinking out loud here. If you're trying to figure out the factory loading in year 4 of the crediting period, and the data you have available from all the plants is 3 to 4 years old, I'm just not sure how useful that is, but maybe I'm missing something.
No, I don't think you're missing anything. I think that's spot on. We're limited in what we can do, really. I mean, it's the same in other protocols where in essence, let me use an example. We might look at production in an ag setting, and we will try to compare that to regional production. And the regional data is hard to find. Sometimes it's state level data as opposed to something that's probably better, which is county level data. Sometimes that data is 5 years old, sometimes 7, sometimes 10. Data availability is always a challenge. Certainly, your point is well made. What I'll step back and suggest is that these are highly hypothetical academic arguments that we're going to see massive levels or statistically significant levels of change in production somewhere else in the world. It's going to pop up here, driven largely by a relatively small US offset price. We think the risk in general is low. We think, given conditions in the US, the demand for production, that this is highly unlikely to happen. Nonetheless, we respect that this has occurred internationally, and we should craft a mechanism. We think this is the most robust but responsive to market conditions. Certainly happy to entertain other thoughts, though.
Sammy, this is Craig.
Sammy, oh, go ahead, Craig. Sorry.
Just a couple of thoughts. First of all, I thought that historical data was reasonably more recent than that, but the point is well taken. Trying to tie any leakage analysis into dated information is somewhat problematic. We ought to discuss the notion of also maybe just tying it into a comparative analysis where adipic acid production globally is linked to some broader metric of manufacturing or industrial activity. And I realize that that's a crude approximation, but my guess is that there's a fairly whatever the historical record is telling us about the demand for adipic acid as manufacturing indices rise and fall, I suspect it's a reasonably robust relationship, and nonetheless, it would provide a good historical benchmark to saying how does current production level from a project compare to that sort of global relationship, and if there's a market difference, that would be a red flag. I realize the devil's in the details there, but we ought to have a broader discussion about that.
This is Bill. I have a question. How does production shifting occur when you're a company with only one adipic acid line globally? Or is that just not even applicable in that situation?
I would say nonsensical, non-applicable, but the devil's in the details, as we said. But the way that we crafted it and in the specific language proposed to the workgroup members that were most actively looking at it was such that if you were a member of some sort of a corporate group that had multiple entities, it's in that context that you're most likely to be shifting production. So if you're a standalone entity, I would suggest that the risk of a global competitor moving production to your facility in order for you to take advantage of slightly lower production costs due to offset volumes is even less likely.
Okay.
always a really simple conceptual issue and simple to implement leakage, no doubt. Any further thoughts on leakage, or certainly we can go back to discussions of baseline settings. This is actually the end of the road.
Sammy, I'd just say one thing on leakage. I mean, wondering if you could have something that says, if the data is available, you can use this, factory loading option, and if the data is not available, then you do something else. Maybe it's a little more restrictive, like a cap or something like that. So way to get out of it in case the data, maybe it's available today and not 3 years from now, or maybe it's not available today and available in 3 years. So
yeah, that's right. That's exactly what we did have. Struggling to think what the feedback was, but yeah, I think what we proposed was, all right, sure, let's tailor this to some of the more advanced thinking from specific workgroup members who seem to really like it, but have a fallback option where we do something else. I don't think we use this maximum production as the fallback. I think what we pitched was something more like, all right, let the project developer come up with some analysis as to how they can demonstrate their facility isn't gaming production, and leave it a bit more flexible as to how they demonstrate. I think that's what we had, but I'm certainly happy to take your thoughts on that, or using the max production in lieu of availability of such data.
Yeah, I mean, the max production is clean, at least. The project developer coming up with their own rationales, sometimes works and sometimes can be, again, if the arbiter of that analysis, I guess would be the reserve staff, is in the position to be able to, really assess that. That's my initial reaction.
Mm-hmm. And I think, Sammy, part of the reason why the production cap was not a slam dunk for other workgroup members is partially because you can have leakage at low production levels based on sort of this competitive advantage of credit prices. And that's most likely to happen in a recession scenario, but at least my understanding is the specific problem would happen if you are in a recession and for some reason the credit prices didn't also tank. So perhaps if there was a kind of a compliance obligation or something. And so I don't expect that low recession price advantage to be a real concern, but I guess just to give some color to the max production not being necessarily sufficient for all workgroup members. That being said, I think having that cap is also appropriate as a fallback, generally speaking.
Yeah, that's good feedback. And then again, that second dot point right in the middle there, that's that could be overly punitive as well for the same reasons that you described. Okay, well that's good. It makes it clean and easier for everybody to foresee what could be used, that we could have this highly specialized option there, and then also have a simple fallback that's pretty basic, but can nonetheless eliminate the largest potential risk. Okay, well, we appreciate that. And again, listen, we'll certainly be providing detailed drafts where you'll see the nitty-gritty and you'll have a chance to review it and provide finite feedback on specific words chosen. At this point, we want to get into some of the broader issues, and this discussion will help us put together that draft. But you'll be able to see it and have a good chance to provide further feedback at that point. Further feedback on leakage, baseline setting. Does anybody else want to throw out any issues to talk over with the benefit of having the wider group on the line? Anything else we'd like to go over? Okay, let's hit a couple of those procedural slides and then pause again. I don't think we've got any questions from the audience. I think it's a relatively small group today, but let's get through this admin stuff and then do maybe one more awkward silence and see if that generates further thought. Next steps, get us written feedback if you like. I think this discussion has been really useful. I've taken some notes on my side laptop. No doubt my colleagues have, but specific written feedback, if you like, would also be quite useful. We'll give you our email addresses in a minute in case you've forgotten who we are. If you're looking at written feedback, it's nice to have a sort of a finite timeline there, just so that we can sort of wrap that up and maybe move towards throwing out an updated draft. So maybe that date there can be a sort of a TBD as to when to expect us to send a draft out. I suspect, you know, we might sort of move quickly, a little bit quicker than that even, depending on what the workgroup members say. But I think we've captured a lot today. We might not need to sort of pause, but let's see how we go. We will make updates to the previous draft. We'll send that out to you. Reach out if you want to have phone discussions. We've had a lot of those, as many as we need, very welcome. We can also have group discussions if we want. Draft protocol will go out to you. You study it closely. Get in touch, let us know. If we need another workgroup meeting, we'll have it. Otherwise, we can certainly keep you all fully informed at the very least. Public comment period, we absolutely will do it. It'll be 30 days. Let's say sometime in July, depending on how the next steps go. We'll definitely have a public comment webinar, let's say mid-July, further revisions, and then that last date there, September 30th, we will diligently work towards that date because it's the next available full work group, full board meeting. If we're ready sooner, fantastic. But let's have that as the loose target date. Key contacts, you know me. There's also that policy email address that we all check. Heather mans that very, very closely, but we all are able to see it. So don't be shy, reach out. You probably all have Craig's email address as well, and then no doubt we've shared emails with Sarah and John too. So if you have those, feel free to reach out to any of the broader team or send an email to us and we can forward it if you like to those other team members. But that's it by way of logistics. So let's pause again and see if anybody wants to raise any further points before we conclude. Okay, maybe just a very quick recap. We had a very good level of discussion on the static baseline approach, in particular the two approaches that we've talked about, being the 5-year simple average, as well as maybe requiring the most conservative of those 5. And then we also talked about some mechanism to perhaps move from the simple average to something a little more conservative based on the variability that we see relative to a given year. So we'll explore those and we'll put something like that into writing with some specific language, and that'll be included in the next draft that you're able to see. We then also talked about the baseline a little bit less, and with respect to leakage, we'll enshrine something that looks like this. Focus on international data. That's kind of the bullseye, assuming that there's multiple facilities out there. And then we'll enshrine something like this type of fallback simple option that can be used in every instance, especially when there's data lacking. So that's what you'll expect to see in the next draft. If you have any other thoughts, get them to us in writing, ideally by this date, but at any time would be fantastic, anytime before we celebrate the adoption. And you can expect us to reach out sometime very soon with a full draft. So again, we really appreciate all of you volunteering your time to help us build this, volunteering your time today, and also the extensive discussions we've had. This is exactly what we need in order to have the best chance of building something decent here. So on behalf of the reserve, a big thank you.
Great,
Thanks,
thank
Sammy.
you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, guys.
Bye-bye.
Take care.